सारा कनेक्शन था उसका नो कॉन्फिडेंस मूव जो कि बाहर से इनिशिएटेड थी। तो जब एक दफ़ा मुल्क की हाईएस्ट सिक्योरिटी बॉडी ये कंफर्म कर देती है, उसके बाद तो ये प्रोसीडिंग्स ये इररेलेवेंट थी कि नंबर्स कितने हैं।
ये बचकाना हरकत, ये मैदान से भागना इमरान खान ने अपने आप को एक्सपोज कर चुका है।
Imran Khan ducks no confidence vote. He has done what no civilian leader in Pakistan has done before. Will this have far-reaching consequences for Pakistan's political trajectory?
So in this week's column, you've looked at quite interesting the developments in Pakistan, but focused a bit on Imran Khan. You use this interesting metaphor of Samson, the biblical character of Samson, who brings down the house literally against the Philistine, who kidnapped him, destroying himself and them in the process. What's interesting now, so one of the things you pointed out this out in earlier columns as well, but now it's become very stark that Imran Khan has managed to reverse the trend with the army in certain ways. It is not, he's brought it vis-a-vis India, for example. He has raised an anti-India pitch when the army sort of tried a little bit of it later on when it was about, I think it was sugarcane, those trade during Pakistan's economic crisis. More recently, the army, which he's kept, this time, of course, he made some mention of India's foreign policy, but that was for his own ends vis-a-vis the US and the army. How do you see that, him trying to bring the army front and center in a way to politics or confronting the army? How do you see that fitting into because the logic is that Pakistan's politics happens and the army really as we know, controls as well as stays above the fray. Do you think that it's sort of being dragged down into the fray of Pakistan's politics now with Imran Khan's moves he's made?
Yeah, I think when the army said, it wants to be neutral, it is above the fray, but it was always involved in the politics. I think they've developed the art of remote control through this, what was called the hybrid regime, where army does not directly rule, but the civilians, it manages to control them. Now, I think in this case, it is no secret in Pakistan that he came to power because of the Pakistan and the ISI's active support. His opponents say the 2018 elections were rigged. Even then, he didn't get a full majority, so the army helped stitch together a coalition to put him in power. I think what has happened is really they fell apart. I think once the coalition was set up, Imran was not doing what the army expected him to do, which was run a decent administration, because they wanted a decent front office where he could run the country, maintain the political stability at home, and to conduct foreign policy, because they thought he's a person who is acceptable in international phase. So I think on all the fronts, he has led down the army. I think I would say economy, has been completely mismanaged. He kept changing his finance ministers, finance secretaries. So in a sense, really there was nothing he did which helped stabilize the economy. Second, I think on the foreign policy front, I think he broke the old rules. That the Saudis and the UAE were the best friends of Pakistan. Instead of that, he sought to go against the Saudis and join with the Turks. Turks and Saudis were fighting. And then he made a big thing about the Europeans and the whole French ambassador demanding expulsion through Islamic groups. So I think, and then with the US, he's actually made things worse for the bilateral relationships by saying, when Afghanistan fell, or slavery changed, the Afghans have broken the chains of slavery, then saying things like, that the Americans are the ones who are trying to unseat him. So I think he's really, that there was very little agreement between the two of them on foreign policy, on the national security policy, on the domestic side as well, and on the economic management. So at some point, the army said, look, we've had enough. And they said, we are neutral. Otherwise, they were his patrons. And I think the crisis began when the patron withdrew his support and said he was neutral. That is when he actually initially tried to find a way out. And now he's actually stepped up the attacks on the army because he wants the army to support him, what may. Because he thinks of his own ego. He's so important that the army had no choice but to support him. But the army has other ideas. So I think this tension will play itself out. But I would say one other thing, it is not clear if the armed forces are fully united at this point of time.
Right.
So that could be, for example, this whole story of Faiz Hamid, when he wanted the ISI chief, who became very close to Imran, to ask him to keep staying close. Bajwa wanted to shift him. Now, Bajwa himself retires at the end of the year. So they could be jockeying within the Pakistan Army who will succeed him. So it's possible that there are fissures. Normally, Pakistan Army is a very united, coherent force. But in a sense, Imran is probing the potential cleavages within the army. So I think, so he's confronting the army's dominance. He's playing the Islamic card, which normally was the preserve of the Pakistan Army. He's whipping up anti-Americanism, which some army is to regulate, and on the economic front, which is his main responsibility, where things have really gone down the hill. So I think it's a real crisis in Pakistan.
Everyone should read the piece. It's on the IndianExpress.com, as well as in the description wherever you're watching this. It has a lot more detail. So next, there is a sense that, just on the last point you made, that Imran Khan from the very beginning, unlike either the PPP or certainly the PMLN, his support base has never been that wide. Even in the last election, he's a relatively new entrant into Pakistan's politics, and he relied on the more right-wing, the more fundamentalist elements, religio-fundamentalist elements within Pakistan for support. Do you see that only deepening now, and that could be not good news for the neighborhood, particularly for us? That sort of his even if it's in the medium term, because we don't know how this is going to play out. Of course, it's changing, the developments are changing every day. But that him trying more on the Hafiz Saids and the sort of that kind of politics within Pakistan.
No, I think those groups, I mean, the militant groups are still really under the army's control. What he's doing is his mass base was really the middle and the lower middle classes, which were genuinely looking for a better alternative to the normal political classes that dominated the scene. But I think what he has done after his coming into power purely as an opportunism, I think, when institutions like Tehreek-e-Labbaik, which as they come to the force, he's trying to mobilize them and expand his coalition. So I think some of these more, naturally conservative forces, which are becoming recently political, and that he's trying to say, look, I'm standing up for Islam, while the others are not. And then I'm standing up to the Americans and the West because I'm really truer Islam, truer Muslim than the other guy. So I think he's playing the religious card, and combined with it, the anti-American card, which in the past, the army ran this with a careful calibration, while he's now trying to use that to outflanking the army. And I think that's where the problems are.
Final question, one of the big fears in India, I don't know how justified it is, has always been that when Pakistan is facing internal trouble now, whether it's military rule, quasi-military rule, or domestic, or that you end up, the LOC and things flare up, or there's other, ties with India, much as with here, Pakistan sometimes plays a role in our domestic politics, but there's a sort of added dimension to it because of the situation of the border and the LOC. Do you see that, because the ceasefire has held this time, despite the anti-India rhetoric by Khan, in the last few months, even years, the last few months, it has held quite well. The 2003 ceasefire when it was re-implemented. Do you see that becoming a factor in any way, or is it something we should be wary of?
No, I think, on the positive side, I mean, what is the new in this crisis, at least, certainly, I mean, no one is blaming India for it.
Yeah.
When he's talking about hostile forces, in the old days, it used to be, Hindu-Yahudi conspiracy, that the India-Israel trying to unseat him. Now, his whole ire and anger now is directed against the US and Europe. So India is not part of that equation. So that is the good news. But the bad news is, when, as you rightly said, if things go wrong, whether there would be attempts at turning the crisis, draw India into it. But I think our policy of keeping distance from Pakistan, I mean, not really being drawn into any serious conversation, or I think in that sense, taken us out of their domestic equations at this point of time. When things settle, perhaps something else would happen. But at this point of time, my sense is that I think India is reasonably secure. But tomorrow, if it involves, as I said, look, the army is the one which negotiated ceasefire. In fact, General Bajwa, in a speech last week at the Islamabad Security Forum, mentioned the fact that ceasefire is holding and he wants to normalize relations. In fact, it is the army that has been saying Pakistan needs decent relationships with its neighbors. It needs to, focus on geo-economics and not the geopolitics. So in that sense, it was Bajwa, General Bajwa, who's pointing to a future positive direction. While Imran Khan was the one who said, no, we can't trade with anything with India till the Kashmir issue is sorted out. And he's taken the radical position. So in the past, civilians wanted to do good things with India and the military would veto them. But this time, military seems to want to do things with us. At least General Bajwa wants to do with us, and Imran Khan is undermining it. But tomorrow, if there's another chief, or if some big shakedown happens in the army itself, then we don't know what the next chief is, how the internal politics in the army might play itself out. But I think at this point, the hands are full. I don't think they will want to mess around with India. But if you remember, when India and China were having a problem, a lot of us thought maybe Pakistan would take advantage of it on the border. They didn't. I think at this point, at least, we must be on our guard, but I don't think we need to excessively worry about it, but watch the situation as it unfolds carefully.
Right. Thanks so much. We will keep watching Pakistan. Everything's involved now. The courts, the opposition, there's a lot going on, but it's a story we'll be tracking in the Express. Do read the column. It's on the IndianExpress.com. We'll see you next week, sir. Thanks so much.